Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. I thought we'd take a little look at these DMs or text messages that Darren Gee has put out. Messages which Shaun Attwood claims are solid proof that James English somehow manipulated Darren Gee into saying things that he didn't mean, into saying things about Shaun Attwood which have shattered Shaun's reputation, as if Shaun didn't do that himself by filming the infamous Daddygate video. I'm not going to go into details of that video here. There are videos on my channel which will explain it to you in detail though, but suffice to say, it's a very distasteful video. It's very concerning that somebody in Mr. Attwood's position would film a video of that type, and it involved a woman dressed in, let's say, highly inappropriate clothing. Now, I'm not a prude, so if you don't know what I mean by that, go and check out one of my videos in which I explain it. But that video has led many people to form an extremely negative opinion of Shaun Attwood, and he himself claims that that was his intention. He says he did the most disgusting thing he could think of because he wanted people to believe it. He wanted people to think it was real.
I just thought, to trick this person, I have to go and do things that are completely out of character that would not be expected. To feed this person photos and videos, they would have to be so despicable that that's the only way the troll would accept that they were being given to her by one of our friends who was working against us. We just created this character. We had to go so low to do this to make it believable.
And to this day, he claims that people who don't like what he did are just haters who fell for his prank. So, is it James English that's responsible for Shaun's reputation being in tatters, or is it Shaun who's responsible for Shaun's reputation being in tatters? You can't say that people fell for your prank and then blame somebody else for the fallout. That's not how these things work, but that is exactly what Shaun Attwood is trying to do, and he's using these leaked DMs as evidence. Now, a few people have asked me to cover this, as well as the fact that Shaun and Darren have been cozying up recently, which to an outside observer such as myself does seem odd, but I don't know what goes on behind closed doors. I can only talk about what we see here in the magical world of YouTube, but it does seem a little bit suspicious that they're both now best mates. So Attwood's current claim is that James English is the one who turned public opinion against him, and he used Darren Gee as a pawn in some kind of battle to be the biggest podcaster on YouTube, which doesn't make any sense for several reasons. The most obvious reason, which I think most of you will remember if you've been following along from the start, is that Darren Gee was making very strong accusations about Shaun Attwood long before he spoke about Shaun Attwood on James English's podcast. And those accusations first arose in public when Darren Gee bumped into Cody Leahy, I believe it was in Manchester, and they went on a live stream together. That was when Darren Gee first started firing shots at Shaun Attwood, giving him both barrels. It was nothing to do with James English. Whether you like James English or not, the fact of the matter is, he did not make Darren Gee say these things about Shaun Attwood, because we all know that Darren Gee was saying them with Cody Leahy. Darren just escalated it on James's podcast, and as a grown adult man, that is for Darren to decide to do or not to decide to do. Now, the claim that James English was trying to somehow get Shaun out of the picture in some kind of attempt to surpass him in the podcast game, that's just been completely fabricated and pulled out of Shaun Attwood's rear end. Again, the facts don't stand up because, first of all, James's numbers per video absolutely demolish Shaun Attwood's numbers. Shaun's channel has taken such a nosedive in recent months, and although he himself claims that the trolls do nothing but bring in views, he was on another channel the other day, a channel with 30,000 subscribers, and the video which features Shaun Attwood only got 730 views the last time I checked, and that was in 2 days. If Shaun Attwood was a big name in the podcast game, he'd be taking in a lot more than 730 views in 2 days when he goes on someone else's channel. The only time Shaun is getting decent numbers at the moment, and by decent numbers I'm still talking about a fraction of his subscriber count, we're talking maybe 30,000 views, is when he name drops Darren Gee. surprise, surprise, he's putting these little clickbait 1-minute clips on his channel, Darren Gee's opinion on salt and vinegar crisps and all that kind of stuff, and these are bringing in like 30,000 views. So he's just totally clickbaiting Darren now that he's got the opportunity to do it. He's making hay while the sun shines, and hey, I'm not going to hate on a man for doing that. But meanwhile, James English is hitting massive numbers on the regular, and he doesn't need to clickbait Darren Gee to do it. So I don't think James is worried about Shaun overtaking him in the podcast game. Yes, Shaun Attwood has more subscribers, but that actually means the disparity in the views is even worse. But let's take a look at these messages that Darren Gee has dropped. I'm not going to read them all out. You can go to Shaun Attwood's video if you want them to be read out. But let me know if you see anything here anywhere that shows James English manipulating Darren Gee. And I'll give you Shaun Attwood's take on this as well. Darren put these out in a video, which unfortunately had been deleted by the time I was able to get down to making this video. But Shaun Attwood also immediately put them in a video. And he went through the whole lot, although I do believe he left out one or two, probably for tactical reasons. But he went through the whole lot absolutely seething, trying to ascribe motives to James English, trying to make his audience believe, once again, a false narrative, and hoping that people would fall for it. It's just the usual BS from Shaun Attwood. His claims are just false. I think Shaun is relying on his thumbnail, which shows Darren being used as a puppet to persuade people, because his commentary on these messages, it was so wrong that it made no sense. A lot of it, as you can see, is just normal conversation between two guys, a little bit of banter here and there. I'm sure James wasn't expecting Darren to publicly leak DMs because it's not really something that is expected. So this was just two mates chatting in private. The main thread of Shaun's argument is that James jokingly mentioned being the king of the podcast game and that this somehow shows a motive. And Shaun goes into detail about what the motive is because of this statement that James made. And Shaun was absolutely seething about this. Make no mistake, he went over it several times in this video as if he couldn't believe that James had the cheek to big himself up in a private message, even though it's clearly just banter. And James is entitled to be pleased with how his show is doing, how his channel's doing, and the laughing emojis, they kind of give the game away that he's just joking around, he's just having a little bit of a laugh with a mate. But James says, you know I'm the king of the podcast game, and Shaun insists that that line shows a detailed motive. Shaun insists that that proves James English wanted Shaun Attwood out of the game so that James could be the biggest. Which is a very weird thing to say because they were not, first of all, in competition with each other anyway. As I said, the views on James's channel are so much higher than the views on Shaun's channel. But it's also not as if they had an agreement between each other that they were going to be equal at all times. Nobody was going to overtake the other one. That's not how things work, and it's ridiculous that Shaun expects to crowbar this statement down the throats of his audience so they swallow it as some kind of motive. There's no reason to believe that James ever saw Shaun as a threat. This is an innocuous statement that he has made, and it doesn't prove anything at all, let alone that James wanted to get rid of Shaun Attwood. And it's not as if the fact that Darren and James discussed Daddygate, which they did, it's not as if they discussed that on James's show as an attempt to destroy Shaun Attwood. This was something that many people were talking about, so just because it was damaging to Shaun Attwood doesn't mean that people shouldn't have been allowed to talk about it. It was making waves in podcast circles at the time. Darren Gee and James English were one of the few people that actually had the balls to talk about it at the time. It doesn't make it defamation. Just because something damages Shaun Attwood's reputation doesn't mean it's defamation to discuss it. The fact of the matter is, the Daddygate video was disgraceful and people are entitled to talk about that. I didn't see any attempt by James English to destroy Shaun Attwood, even on the podcast with Darren Gee. It was Darren Gee ranting about Shaun Attwood in the same fashion that he'd ranted about Shaun Attwood previously. And I believe that Darren Gee, or certainly I believed at the time that Darren Gee was ranting about Shaun Attwood in that fashion because of the Daddygate video. Because he'd seen the video that we'd all seen, and he'd come to conclusions that many of us had come to. But Shaun expects his audience to swallow the fact that James bigging himself up is proof that he wanted to destroy Shaun Attwood. But the main thing that Shaun is seething about, and this is the the main point that Shaun Attwood wanted to hammer home. You could tell this is the thing that angered him the most, is the fact that James had the nerve to show Darren Shaun's rap sheet in a DM, even though it had been tweeted publicly to them both. So James showed Darren Shaun Attwood's rap sheet, and on Shaun Attwood's rap sheet it mentions 2 charges relating to minors. They're not explained in any detail, it just says 2 charges relating to minors on Shaun's rap sheet. And Shaun says that this is evidence that James English manipulated Darren Gee because James did not explain to Darren that the minor charges related to Wild Woman's son buying weed with one of the gang's business phones. Now, it doesn't take a high IQ genius to figure out that that doesn't hold up at all, because these messages, first of all, were from December. So how would James have known that the charges were about Wild Woman's son? Wild Woman didn't even exist on Shaun Attwood's channel until recently, other than being mentioned in passing. And Shaun Attwood never explained these minor charges at all, at any point, until Wild Woman suddenly appeared on his show a couple of months ago. So how on earth was James or Darren supposed to know that these charges, which mention minors, were actually in relation to Wild Woman's son? As if that makes it really any better. But how were they supposed to know that? There's no way that they would have known that, because Shaun Attwood probably never expected anyone to get their hands on that rap sheet and never mentioned it. He never explained it beforehand. It certainly hadn't been explained in December. And of course, guys are going to be upset or concerned when they see that somebody's rap sheet refers to minors. If you found your mate's rap sheet online and it had mention of minors on it, you'd be concerned. You'd be right to be concerned. Now line it up with the fact that everyone had just seen the Daddygate video and was talking about the Daddygate video. It's not hard to see why James and Darren thought the worst. Now maybe they should have asked Shaun what the charges meant, maybe, but it's not evidence that James manipulated Darren. All it's evidence of is that James and Darren both thought the worst of Shaun when they saw this rap sheet. And Shaun just expects his audience to believe that the reason his reputation's taking a hit now is because of James English puppeteering Darren Gee. There's no evidence being provided in this video that Shaun's put out of that. We also now know that Shaun Attwood received a police caution for doxing 2 children on his podcast, so it's nobody's fault but Shaun's if people question him about these things, and if people are suspicious about these things. It's only right that people question him, in my opinion. And as already discussed, even before the rap sheet came into it, before Darren and James had even had this conversation, Darren was publicly calling Shaun Attwood every name under the sun in a podcast with Cody Leahy. So how on earth is James to blame for what Darren has been saying about Shaun Attwood? This narrative that Shaun is trying to push once again does not stand up to the slightest scrutiny, and I hope that none of you fall for it, because it's evidently absolutely ridiculous what he's trying to say. Now Shaun's demanding an apology from James English, believe it or not. Seriously. So Shaun's demanding an apology from James, or he's going to sue him, and James has obviously not apologised. But I would love to see it get to court and for James's lawyer to just crack out the Daddygate video on a big screen as evidence, because a defence to defamation is that you honestly believe the statements to be true and have some kind of evidence to back that opinion up. Shaun Attwood would not have a leg to stand on, so it's ridiculous for him to threaten to sue James English, but we all know Shaun isn't going to try and sue James, because even Shaun Attwood is not that stupid. All he's trying to do is ride on James's coattails, try and get a reaction out of him, to try and get more views, because he knows that James's views blow his views out the water. He's simply trying to clout chase, and he's also trying to deflect from his own actions in filming the Daddygate video by trying to blame somebody else for the fallout of that video. That's all Shaun Attwood is trying to do here. It's so blatantly obvious, but a few people, as I say, were asking me to cover it, so massive shout out to them, including Doodle, Screw It and Do It, and he's got a lot of videos on this situation as well. One of them has over 130,000 views, and he doesn't crack open the champagne and do a celebration run like Shaun Attwood does when he gets 100,000 views, which is extremely rare nowadays. So definitely sub to Doodle Scroot and do it. I'll put a link down below. And also don't forget to sub to Wheezy over on Odyssey. Of course, Wheezy's still alive, you know, he's over on Odyssey, so you can go and check him out over there. I'll put a link down below. And also the Honest Truth podcast here on YouTube, because they have been sound as a pound. So go and subscribe to them. You can listen to their show right here on YouTube, and I'll put a link down below to that. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments as well, and don't forget to smash the subscribe button if you're into that kind of thing. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. I don't know when, but I will definitely catch you in the next one. Cheers folks.